The Introduction of the Prairie. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by William Peck. The Prairie by James Fenimore Cooper. Introduction. The geological formation of that portion of the American Union which lies between the Alleghanies and the Rocky Mountains, has given rise to many ingenious theories. Virtually the whole of this immense region is a plain. For a distance extending nearly 1,500 miles east and west, and 600 north and south, there is scarcely an elevation worthy to be called a mountain. Even hills are not common, though a good deal of the face of the country has more or less of that rolling character which is described in the opening pages of this work. There is much reason to believe that the territory which now composes Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and a large portion of the country west of the Mississippi, lay formerly under water. The soil of all the former states has the appearance of an alluvial deposit, and isolated rocks have been found of a nature and in situations which render it difficult to refute the opinion that they have been transferred to their present beds by floating ice. This theory assumes that the great lakes were the deep pools of one immense body of fresh water, which lay too low to be drained by the eruption that laid bare the land. It will be remembered that the French, when masters of the Canadas and Louisiana, claimed the whole of the territory in question. Their hunters and advanced troops held the first communications with the savage occupants, and the earliest written accounts we possess of these vast regions are from the pens of their missionaries. Many French words have, consequently, become of local use in this quarter of America, and not a few names given in that language have been perpetuated. When the adventurers, who first penetrated these wilds, met, in the centre of the forest, immense plains, covered with rich verdure or rank grasses, they naturally gave them the appellation of meadows. As the English succeeded the French, and found a peculiarity of nature, differing from all they had yet seen on the continent, already distinguished by a word that did not express anything in their own language, they left these natural meadows in possession of their title of convention. In this manner has the word prairie been adopted into the English tongue. The American prairies are of two kinds. Those which lie east of the Mississippi are comparatively small, are exceedingly fertile, and are always surrounded by forest. They are susceptible of high cultivation, and are fast becoming settled. They abound in Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, and Indiana. They labor under the disadvantages of a scarcity of wood and water, evils of a serious character, until art had come to supply the deficiencies of nature. As coal is said to abound in all that region, and wells are generally successful, the enterprise of the emigrants is gradually prevailing against these difficulties. The second description of these natural meadows lies west of the Mississippi, at a distance of a few hundred miles from that river, and is called the Great Prairies. They resemble the steppes of Tartary, more than any other known portion of Christendom, being in fact a vast country, incapable of sustaining a dense population, in the absence of the two great necessaries already named. Rivers abound, it is true, but this region is nearly destitute of brooks and the smaller watercourses which tend so much to comfort and fertility. The origin and date of the great American prairies form one of nature's most majestic mysteries. The general character of the United States, of the Canadas, and of Mexico, is that of luxuriant fertility. It would be difficult to find another portion of the world of the same extent which has so little useless land as the inhabited parts of the American Union. Most of the mountains are arable, and even the prairies in this section of the Republic are of deep alluvion. The same is true between the Rocky Mountains and the Pacific. Between the two lies the broad belt of comparative desert, which is the scene of this tale, appearing to interpose a barrier to the progress of the American people westward. The great prairies appear to be the final gathering place of the red men. The remnants of the Mohicans and the Delawares, of the Creeks, Choctaws, and Cherokees, are destined to fulfill their time on these vast plains. The entire number of the Indians within the Union is differently computed at between 1 and 300,000 souls. Most of them inhabit the country west of the Mississippi. At the period of the tale, they dwelt in open hostility, national feuds passing from generation to generation. The power of the Republic has done much to restore peace to these wild scenes, and it is now possible to travel in security where civilized man did not dare to pass unprotected 25 years ago. The reader, who has perused the two former works, of which this is the natural successor, will recognize an old acquaintance in the principal character of the story. We have here brought him to his end, and we trust he will be permitted to slumber in the peace of the just. J. F. Cooper, Paris, June 1832. End of introduction. Prairie by James Fenimore Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Peck. I pray thee, shepherd, if that love or gold can in this desert place, by entertainment, bring us where we may rest ourselves and feed, as you like it. Much was said and written at the time concerning the policy of adding the vast regions of Louisiana to the already immense and but half-tenanted territories of the United States. As the warmth of the controversy, however, subsided, and party considerations gave place to more liberal views, the wisdom of the measure began to be generally conceded. It soon became apparent to the meanest capacity that, while nature had placed a barrier of desert to the extension of our population in the west, the measure had made us the masters of a belt of fertile country, which, in the revolutions of the day, might have become the property of a rival nation. It gave us the sole command of the great thoroughfare of the interior, and placed the countless tribes of savages, who lay along our borders, entirely within our control. It reconciled conflicting rights, and quieted national distrust. It opened 1,000 avenues to the inland trade, and to the waters of the Pacific. And if ever time or necessity shall require a peaceful division of this vast empire, it assures us of a neighbour that will possess our language, our religion, our institutions, and, it is also to be hoped, our sense of political justice. Although the purchase was made in 1803, the spring of the succeeding year was permitted to open, before the official prudence of the Spaniard, who held the province for his European master, admitted the authority or even of the entrance of its new proprietors. But the forms of the transfer were no sooner completed, and the new government acknowledged, than swarms of that restless people, which is ever found hovering on the skirts of American society, plunged into the thickets that fringed the right bank of the Mississippi, with the same careless hardihood as had already sustained so many of them in their toilsome progress from the Atlantic States to the eastern shores of the Father of the Rivers. The Mississippi is thus termed in several of the Indian languages. The reader will gain a more just idea of the importance of this stream, if he recalls to mind the fact that the Missouri and the Mississippi are properly the same river. Their united lengths cannot be greatly short of 4,000 miles. Time was necessary to blend the numerous and affluent colonists of the lower province with their new compatriots, but the thinner and more humble population above was almost immediately swallowed in the vortex which attended the tide of instant immigration. The inroad from the east was a new and sudden outbreaking of a people who had endured a momentary restraint, after having been rendered nearly resistless by success. The toils and hazards of former undertakings were forgotten, as these endless and unexplored regions, with all their fancied as well as real advantages, were laid open to their enterprise. The consequences were such as might easily have been anticipated from so tempting an offering, placed as it was before the eyes of a race long trained in adventure and nurtured in difficulties. Thousands of elders of what were then called the New States, all the states admitted to the American Union since the Revolution are called New States, with the exception of Vermont, that had claims before the war, which were not, however, admitted until a later day. Back to the text. broke up from the enjoyment of their hard-earned indulgences, and were to be seen leading long lines of descendants, born and reared in the forests of Ohio and Kentucky, deeper into the land, in quest of that which might be termed, without the aid of poetry, their natural and more congenial atmosphere. The distinguished and resolute forester, who first penetrated the wilds of the latter state, was of the number. This adventurous and venerable patriarch was now seen making his last remove, placing the endless river between him and the multitude his own success had drawn around him, and seeking for the renewal of enjoyments which were rendered worthless in his eyes, when trammelled by the forms of human institutions. Footnote: Colonel Boone, the patriarch of Kentucky, this venerable and hardy pioneer of civilization, immigrated to an estate 300 miles west of the Mississippi, in his 92nd year, because he found a population of 10 to the square mile inconveniently crowded. In the pursuit of adventures such as these, men are ordinarily governed by their habits or deluded by their wishes. A few, led by the phantoms of hope, and ambitious of sudden affluence, sought the mines of the virgin territory, but by far the greater portion of the emigrants were satisfied to establish themselves along the margins of the larger watercourses, content with the rich returns that the generous alluvial bottoms of the rivers never failed to bestow on the most desultory industry. In this manner were communities formed with magical rapidity, and most of those who witnessed the purchase of the empty empire have lived to see already a populous and sovereign state, parcelled from its inhabitants, and received into the bosom of the national union on terms of political equality. The incidents and scenes which are connected with this legend occurred in the earliest periods of the enterprises which have led to so great and so speedy a result. The harvest of the first year of our possession had long been past, and the fading foliage of a few scattered trees was already beginning to exhibit the hues and tints of autumn, when a train of wagons issued from the bed of a dry rivulet, to pursue its course across the undulating surface of what, in the language of the country of which we write, is called a rolling prairie. The vehicles, loaded with household goods and implements of husbandry, the few straggling sheep and cattle, were herded in the rear, and the rugged appearance and careless mien of the sturdy men who loitered at the sides of the lingering teams, united to announce a band of emigrants seeking for the El Dorado of the West. Contrary to the usual practice of the men of their caste, this party had left the fertile bottoms of the low country, and had found its way, by means only known to such adventurers, across glen and torrent, over deep morasses and arid waste, to a point far beyond the usual limits of civilized habitations. In their front were stretched those broad plains which extend, with so little diversity of character, to the bases of the Rocky Mountains, and many long and dreary miles in their rear foamed the swift and turbid waters of La Platte. The appearance of such a train in that bleak and solitary place was rendered the more remarkable by the fact that the surrounding country offered so little, that was tempting to the cupidity of speculation, and, if possible, still less that was flattering to the hopes of an ordinary settler of new lands. The meagre herbage of the prairie promised nothing, in favour of a hard and unyielding soil, over which the wheels of the vehicles rattled as lightly as if they travelled on a beaten road, neither wagons nor beasts making any deeper impression than to mark that bruised and withered grass, which the cattle plucked from time to time, and as often rejected as food too sour for even hunger to render palatable. Whatever might be the final destination of these adventurers, or the secret causes of their apparent security in so remote and unprotected a situation, there was no visible sign of uneasiness, uncertainty, or alarm among them. Including both sexes and every age, the number of the party exceeded 20. At some little distance in front of the whole marched the individual who, by his position and air, appeared to be the leader of the band. He was a tall, sunburnt man, past the middle age, of a dull countenance and listless manner. His frame appeared loose and flexible, but it was vast, and in reality of prodigious power. It was only at moments, however, as some slight impediment opposed itself to his loitering progress, that his person, which, in its ordinary gait, seemed so lounging and nerveless, displayed any of those energies which lay latent in his system, like the slumbering and unwieldy, but terrible, strength of the elephant. The inferior lineaments of his countenance were coarse, extended, and vacant, while the superior, or those nobler parts which are thought to affect the intellectual being, were low, receding, and mean. The dress of this individual was a mixture of the coarsest vestments of a husbandman with the leathern garments that fashion, as well as use, had in some degree rendered necessary to one engaged in his present pursuits. There was, however, a singular and wild display of prodigal and ill-judged ornaments, blended with his motley attire. In place of the usual deerskin belt, he wore around his body a tarnished silken sash of the most gaudy colours. The buckhorn haft of his knife was profusely decorated with plates of silver. The marten's fur of his cap was of fineness and shadowing that a queen might covet. The buttons of his rude and soiled blanket coat were of the glittering coinage of Mexico. The stock of his rifle was of beautiful mahogany, riveted and banded with the same precious metal, and the trinkets of no less than 3 worthless watches dangled from different parts of his person. In addition to the pack and the rifle which were slung at his back, together with the well-filled and carefully guarded pouch and horn, he had carelessly cast a keen and bright wood-axe across his shoulder, sustaining the weight of the whole with as much apparent ease as if he moved unfettered in limb and free from encumbrance. A short distance in the rear of this man came a group of youths very similarly attired, and bearing sufficient resemblance to each other and to their leader, to distinguish them as the children of one family. Though the youngest of their number could not much have passed the period that, in the nicer judgment of the law, is called the age of discretion, he had proved himself so far worthy of his progenitors as to have reared already his aspiring person to the standard height of his race. There was 1 or 2 others of different mould, whose descriptions must, however, be referred to the regular course of the narrative. Of the females, there were but 2 who had arrived at womanhood, though several white-headed, olive-skinned faces were peering out of the foremost wagon of the train, with eyes of lively curiosity and characteristic animation. The elder of the 2 adults was the sallow and wrinkled mother of most of the party, and the younger was a sprightly, active girl of 18, who in figure, dress, and mien, seemed to belong to a station in society several gradations above that of any one of her visible associates. The second vehicle was covered with a top of cloth so tightly drawn as to conceal its contents with the nicest care. The remaining wagons were loaded with such rude furniture and other personal effects as might be supposed to belong to one ready at any moment to change his abode, without reference to season or distance. Perhaps there was little in this train, or in the appearance of its proprietors, that is not daily to be encountered on the highways of this changeable and moving country, but the solitary and peculiar scenery, in which it was so unexpectedly exhibited, gave to the party a marked character of wildness and adventure. In the little valleys, which, in the regular formation of the land, occurred at every mile of their progress, the view was bounded, on 2 sides, by the gradual and low elevations, which gave name to the description of prairie we have mentioned, while on the others the meagre prospect ran off in long, narrow, barren perspectives, but slightly relieved by a pitiful show of coarse, though somewhat luxuriant vegetation. From the summits of the swells the eye became fatigued with the sameness and chilling dreariness of the landscape. The earth was not unlike the ocean, when its restless waters are heaving heavily, after the agitation and fury of the tempest have begun to lessen. There was the same waving and regular surface, the same absence of foreign objects, and the same boundless extent to the view. Indeed, so very striking was the resemblance between the water and the land, that, however much the geologist must sneer at so simple a theory, it would have been difficult for a poet not to have felt that the formation of the one had been produced by the subsiding dominion of the other. Here and there a tall tree rose out of the bottoms, stretching its naked branches abroad, like some solitary vessel; and, to strengthen the delusion, far in the distance appeared 2 or 3 rounded thickets, looming in the misty horizon like islands resting on the waters. It is unnecessary to warn the practised reader that the sameness of the surface and the low stands of the spectators exaggerated the distances; but, as swell appeared after swell, and island succeeded island, there was a disheartening assurance that long and seemingly interminable tracts of territory must be passed before the wishes of the humblest agriculturist could be realized. Still, the leader of the emigrants steadily pursued his way, with no other guide than the sun, turning his back resolutely on the abodes of civilization, and plunging, at each step, more deeply, if not irretrievably, into the haunts of the barbarous and savage occupants of the country. As the day drew nigher to a close, however, his mind, which was, perhaps, incapable of maturing any connected system of forethought, beyond that which related to the interests of the present moment, became, in some slight degree, troubled with the care of providing for the wants of the hours of darkness. On reaching the crest of a swell that was a little higher than the usual elevations, he lingered a minute, and cast a half-curious eye on either hand, in quest of those well-known signs which might indicate a place where the three grand requisites of water, fuel, and fodder were to be obtained in conjunction. It would seem that his search was fruitless, for after a few moments of indolent and listless examination, he suffered his huge frame to descend the gentle declivity in the same sluggish manner that an over-fatted beast would have yielded to the downward pressure. His example was silently followed by those who succeeded him, though not until the young men had manifested much more of interest, if not of concern, in the brief inquiry which each, in his turn, made on gaining the same look-out. It was now evident, by the tardy movements both of beast and men, that the time of necessary rest was not far distant. The matted grass of the lower land presented obstacles, which fatigue began to render formidable, and the whip was becoming necessary to urge the lingering teams to their labour. At this moment, when, with the exception of the principal individual, a general lassitude was getting the mastery of the travellers, and every eye was cast, by a sort of common impulse, wistfully forward, the whole party was brought to a halt by a spectacle as sudden as it was unexpected. The sun had fallen below the crest of the nearest wave of the prairie, leaving the usual rich and glowing train on its track. In the centre of this flood of fiery light, a human form appeared, drawn against the gilded background, as distinctly and seemingly as palpable as though it would come from within the grasp of any extended hand. The figure was colossal, the attitude musing and melancholy, and the situation directly in the route of the travellers. But embedded, as it was, in its setting of garish light, it was impossible to distinguish its just proportions or true character. The effect of such a spectacle was instantaneous and powerful. The man in front of the emigrants came to a stand, and remained gazing at the mysterious object, with a dull interest that soon quickened into superstitious awe. His sons, so soon as the first emotions of surprise had a little abated, drew slowly around him, and, as they who governed the teams gradually followed their example, the whole party was soon condensed in one silent and wondering group. Notwithstanding the impression of a supernatural agency was very general among the travellers, the ticking of gun-locks was heard, and one or two of the bolder youths cast their rifles forward in readiness for service. "Send the boys off to the right!" exclaimed the resolute wife and mother, in a sharp dissonant voice. "I warrant me, Asa or Abner will give some account of the creature." "It may be well enough to try the rifle," muttered a dull-looking man, whose features, both in outline and expression, bore no small resemblance to the first speaker, and who loosened the stock of his piece, and brought it dexterously to the front, while delivering this opinion. "The Pawnee Loups are said to be hunting by hundreds in the plains. If so, they'll never miss a single man from their tribe." "Stay!" exclaimed a soft-toned but alarmed female voice, which was easily to be traced to the trembling lips of the younger of the two women. "We are not all together. It may be a friend." "Who is scouting now?" demanded the father, scanning at the same time the cluster of his stout sons, with a displeased and sullen eye. "Put by the piece! Put by the piece!" he continued, diverting the other's aim with the finger of a giant, and with the air of one it might be dangerous to deny. "My job is not yet ended. Let us finish the little that remains, in peace." The man, who had manifested so hostile an attention, appeared to understand the other's allusion, and suffered himself to be diverted from his object. The sons turned their inquiring looks on the girl, who had so eagerly spoken to require an explanation; but, as if content with the respite she had obtained for the stranger, she sunk back in her seat, and chose to affect a maidenly silence. In the meantime, the hues of the heavens had often changed. In place of the brightness, which had dazzled the eye, a grey and more sober light had succeeded, and as the setting lost its brilliancy, the proportions of the fanciful form became less exaggerated, and finally distinct. Ashamed to hesitate, now that the truth was no longer doubtful, the leader of the party resumed his journey, using the precaution, as he ascended the slight acclivity, to release his own rifle from the strap, and to cast it into a situation more convenient for sudden use. There was little apparent necessity, however, for such watchfulness. From the moment when it had thus unaccountably appeared, as it were, between the heavens and the earth, the stranger's figure had neither moved nor given the smallest evidence of hostility. Had he harboured any such evil intention, the individual who now came plainly into view seemed but little qualified to execute them. A frame had endured the hardships of more than 80 seasons was not qualified to awaken apprehension in the breast of one so powerful as the emigrant. Notwithstanding his years, and his look of emaciation, if not of suffering, there was that about this solitary being, however, which said that time, and not disease, had laid his hand heavily on him. His form had withered, but it was not wasted. The sinews and muscles, which had once denoted great strength, though shrunken, were still visible, and his whole figure had attained an appearance of induration, which, if it were not for the well-known frailty of humanity, would have seemed to bid defiance to the further approaches of decay. His dress was chiefly of skins, worn with the hair to the weather. A pouch and horn were suspended from his shoulders, and he leaned on a rifle of uncommon length, but which, like its owner, exhibited the wear of long and hard service. As the party drew nigher to this solitary being, and came within a distance to be heard, a low growl issued from the grass at his feet, and then a tall, gaunt, toothless hound arose lazily from his lair, and shaking himself, made some show of resisting the nearer approach of the travellers. "Down, Hector, down," said his master in a voice that was a little tremulous and hollow with age. "What have ye to do, pup, with men who journey on their lawful callings?" "Stranger, if you are much acquainted in this country," said the leader of the emigrants, "can you tell a traveller where he may find necessaries for the night?" "Is the land filled on the other side of the big river?" demanded the old man solemnly, and without appearing to hearken to the other's question; "or why do I see a sight I had never thought to behold again?" "Why, there is no country left, it is true, for such as have money, and are not particular in the choice," returned the emigrant; "but to my taste it is getting crowdy. What may a man call this distance, from this place to the nighest point on the main river?" "A hunted deer could not cool his sides in the Mississippi without travelling a weary 500 miles. "And what may you name the district, hereaway?" "By what name," returned the old man, pointing significantly upward, "would you call the spot where you see yonder cloud?" The emigrant looked at the other, like one who did not comprehend his meaning, and who half suspected he was trifled with, but he contented himself by saying, "You are but a new inhabitant like myself, I reckon, stranger, otherwise you would not be backward in helping a traveller to some advice. Words cost but little, and sometimes lead to friendships." "Advice is not a gift, but a debt that the old owe to the young. What would you wish to know?" "Where I may camp for the night. I'm no great difficulty maker, as to bed and board, but all journeyers, like myself, know the virtue of sweet water and a good browse for the cattle." "Come then with me, and you shall be master of both. And little more is it that I can offer on this hungry prairie." As the old man was speaking, he raised his heavy rifle to his shoulder with a facility a little more remarkable for his years and appearance, and without further words, led the way over the acclivity to the adjacent bottom. Chapter 1. 2 of the Prairie by James Fenimore Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Peck. Up with my tent. Here will I lie tonight. But where tomorrow? Well, all's one for that. Richard III. The travellers soon discovered the usual and unerring evidences that the several articles necessary to their situation were not far distant. A clear and gurgling spring burst out of the side of the declivity, and joining its waters to those of other similar little fountains in its vicinity, their united contributions formed a run, which was easily to be traced for miles along the prairie by the scattering foliage and verdure which occasionally grew within the influence of its moisture. Hither, then, the stranger held his way, eagerly followed by the willing teams, whose instinct gave them a prescience of refreshment and rest. On reaching what he deemed a suitable spot, the old man halted, and with an inquiring look he seemed to demand if it possessed the needed conveniences. The leader of the emigrants cast his eyes understandingly about him, and examined the place with the keenness of one competent to judge of so nice a question, though in that dilatory and heavy manner which rarely permitted him to betray precipitation. "Ay, this may do," he said, satisfied with his scrutiny. "Boys, you have seen the last of the sun. Be stirring." The young men manifested a characteristic obedience. The order, for such in tone and manner it was, in truth, was received with respect. But the utmost movement was the falling of an axe or two from the shoulder to the ground, while their owners continued to regard the place with listless and incurious eyes. In the meantime, the elder traveller, as if familiar with the nature of the impulses by which his children were governed, disencumbered himself of his pack and rifle, and assisted by the man already mentioned as disposed to appeal so promptly to the rifle, he quietly proceeded to release the cattle from the gears. At length the eldest of the sons stepped heavily forward, and, without any apparent effort, he buried his axe to the eye, in the soft body of a cottonwood tree. He stood, a moment, regarding the effect of the blow, with that sort of contempt with which a giant might be supposed to contemplate the puny resistance of a dwarf, and then flourishing the implement above his head, with the grace and dexterity with which the master of the art of offence would wield his nobler, though less useful weapon, he quickly severed the trunk of the tree, bringing its tall top crashing to the earth in submission to his prowess. His companions regarded the operation with indolent curiosity, until they saw the prostrate trunk stretched on the ground, when, as if a signal for a general attack had been given, they advanced in a body to the work, and in a space of time, and with a neatness of execution that would have astonished an ignorant spectator, they stripped a small but suitable spot of its burden of forest, as effectually and almost as promptly as if a whirlwind had passed along the place. The stranger had been a silent but attentive observer of their progress. As tree after tree came whistling down, he cast his eyes upwards at the vacancies they left in the heavens, with a melancholy gaze, and finally turned away, muttering to himself with a bitter smile, like one who disdained giving a more audible utterance to his discontent. Pressing through the group of active and busy children, who had already lighted a cheerful fire, the attention of the old man became next fixed on the movements of the leader of the emigrants and of his savage-looking assistant. These two had, already, liberated the cattle, which were eagerly browsing the grateful and nutritious extremities of the fallen trees, and were now employed about the wagon, which has been described as having its contents concealed with so much apparent care. Notwithstanding this particular conveyance appeared to be as silent and as tenantless as the rest of the vehicles, the men applied their strength to its wheels, and rolled it apart from the others, to a dry and elevated spot, near the edge of the thicket. Here they brought certain poles, which had, seemingly, been long employed in such a service, and fastening their larger ends firmly in the ground, the smaller were attached to the hoops that supported the covering of the wagon. Large folds of cloth were next drawn out of the vehicle, and after being spread around the whole, were pegged to the earth in such a manner as to form a tolerably capacious and exceedingly convenient tent. After surveying their work with inquisitive and perhaps jealous eyes, arranging a fold here and driving a peg more firmly there, the men once more applied their strength to the wagon, pulling it, by its projecting tongue, from the centre of the canopy, until it appeared in the open air, deprived of its covering, and destitute of any other freight than a few light articles of furniture. The latter were immediately removed by the traveller into the tent with his own hands, as though to enter it with a privilege to which even his bosom companion was not entitled. Curiosity is a passion that is rather quickened than destroyed by seclusion, and the old inhabitant of the prairies did not view these precautionary and mysterious movements without experiencing some of its impulses. He approached the tent, and was about to sever two of its folds with the very obvious intention of examining more closely into the nature of its contents, when the man who had once already placed his life in jeopardy seized him by the arm, and with a rude exercise of his strength threw him from the spot he had selected as the one most convenient for his object. "It's an honest regulation, friend," the fellow dryly observed, though with an eye that threatened volumes. "And sometimes it is a safe one, which says, mind your own business." "Men seldom bring anything to be concealed into these deserts," returned the old man, as if willing, and yet a little ignorant, how to apologize for the liberty he had been about to take. "And I had hoped no offence in examining your comforts." "They seldom bring themselves, I reckon, though this has the look of an old country. To my eye it seems not to be overly peopled." "The land is as aged as the rest of the works of the Lord, I believe, but you say true concerning its inhabitants. Many months have passed since I have laid eyes on a face of my own colour, before your own. I say again, friend, I meant no harm. I did not know but there was something behind the cloth that might bring former days to mind." As the stranger ended his simple explanation, he walked meekly away, like one who felt the deepest sense of the right which every man has to the quiet enjoyment of his own, without any troublesome interference on the part of his neighbour; a wholesome and just principle that he had, also, most probably imbibed from the habits of his secluded life. As he passed towards the little encampment of the emigrants, for such the place had now become, he heard the voice of the leader calling aloud, in its hoarse tones, the name of Ellen Wade. The girl, who has been already introduced to the reader, and who was occupied with the others of her sex around the fires, sprang willingly forward at this summons, and passing the stranger with the activity of a young antelope, she was instantly lost behind the forbidden folds of the tent. Neither her sudden disappearance, nor any of the arrangements we have mentioned, seemed, however, to excite the smallest surprise among the remainder of the party. The young men, who had already completed their task with the axe, were all engaged after their lounging and listless manner; some in bestowing equitable portions of the fodder among the different animals, others in plying the heavy pestle of a movable hominy mortar. Hominy is a dish composed chiefly of cracked corn or mace, and one or two in wheeling the remainder of the wagons aside, and arranging them in such a manner as to form a sort of outwork for their otherwise defenceless bivouac. These several duties were soon performed, and as darkness now began to conceal the objects on the surrounding prairie, the shrill-toned termagant, whose voice since the halt has been diligently exercised among her idle and drowsy offspring, announced, in tones that might have been heard at a dangerous distance, that the evening meal waited only for the approach of those who were to consume it. Whatever may be the other qualities of a border man, he is seldom deficient in the virtue of hospitality. The emigrant no sooner heard the sharp call of his wife, than he cast his eyes about him in quest of the stranger, in order to offer him the place of distinction in the rude entertainment to which they were so unceremoniously summoned. "I thank you, friend," the old man replied to the rough invitation to take a seat nigh the smoking kettle. "You have my hearty thanks, but I have eaten for the day, and am not one of them who dig their graves with their teeth. Well, as you wish it, I will take a place for it as long since I have seen people of my colour eating their daily bread." "You are an old settler in these districts, then?" the emigrant rather remarked than inquired, with a mouth filled nearly to overflowing with the delicious hominy prepared by his skilful, though repulsive, spouse. "They told us below we should find settlers something thinnish hereaway, and I must say the report was mainly true, for unless we count the Canada traders on the big river, you are the first white face I have met in a good 500 miles, that is calculating according to your own reckoning." Though I have spent some years in this quarter, I can hardly be called a settler, seeing that I have no regular abode, and seldom pass more than a month at a time on the same range." "A hunter, I reckon?" the other continued, glancing his eyes aside as if to examine the equipments of his new acquaintance. "Your fixens seem none of the best for such a calling." "They are old, and nearly ready to be laid aside, like their master," said the old man, regarding his rifle with a look in which affection and regret were singularly blended. "And I may say they are but little needed, too. You are mistaken, friend, in calling me a hunter. I am nothing better than a trapper." Footnote: It is scarcely necessary to say that this American word means one who takes his game in a trap. It is of general use on the frontiers. The beaver, an animal too sagacious to be easily killed, is oftener taken in this way than in any other. "If you are much of the one, I'm bold to say you are something of the other, for the two callings go mainly together in these districts." "To the shame of the man who is able to follow the first be it so said," returned the trapper, whom in future we shall choose to designate by his pursuit. "For more than 50 years did I carry my rifle in the wilderness, without so much as setting a snare for even a bird that flies the heavens, much less a beast that has nothing but legs for its gifts." "I see but little difference whether a man gets his peltry by the rifle or by the trap," said the ill-looking companion of the emigrant, in his rough manner. "The 'arth has made for our comfort, and for that matter, so are its creatures." "You seem to have but little plunder, stranger." Footnote: The cant word for luggage in the western states of America is plunder. The term might easily mislead one as to the character of the people, who, notwithstanding their pleasant use of so expressive a word, are, like the inhabitants of all new settlements, hospitable and honest. Knavery of the description conveyed by plunder is chiefly found in regions more civilized. "For one who is far abroad," bluntly interrupted the emigrant, as if he had a reason for wishing to change the conversation. "I hope you are better off for skins?" "I make but little use of either," the trapper quietly replied. "At my time of life, food and clothing be all that is needed, and I have little occasion for what you call plunder, unless it may be, now and then, to barter for a horn of powder or a bar of lead." "You are not, then, of these parts by nature, friend?" the emigrant continued, having in his mind the exception which the other had taken to the very equivocal word which he himself, according to the custom of the country, had used for baggage or effects. "I was born on the sea-shore, though most of my life has been passed in the woods." The whole party now looked up at him, as men are apt to turn their eyes on some unexpected object of general interest. One or two of the young men repeated the words, sea-shore, and the woman tendered him one of those civilities, with which, uncouth as they were, she was little accustomed to grace her hospitality, as if in deference to the travelled dignity of her guest. After a long, and seemingly a meditating silence, the emigrant, who had, however, seen no apparent necessity to suspend the functions of his masticating powers, resumed the discourse. "It is a long road, as I have heard, from the waters of the west to the shores of the main sea?" "It is a weary path indeed, friend, and much have I seen, and something I have suffered, in journeying over it." "A man would see a good deal of hard travel in going its length." 75 years have I been upon the road, and there are not half the number of leagues in the whole distance, after you leave the Hudson, on which I have not tasted venison of my own killing. But this is vain boasting. Of what use are former deeds, when time draws to an end?" "I once met a man that had boated on the river he names," observed the eldest son, speaking in a low tone of voice, like one who distrusted his knowledge, and deemed it prudent to assume a becoming diffidence in the presence of a man who had seen so much. "From his tell, it must be considerable stream, and deep enough for a keel boat, from top to bottom." "It is a wide and deep water course, and many sightly towns are growing on its banks," returned the trapper, "and yet it is but a brook to the waters of the endless river." "I call nothing a stream that a man can travel round," exclaimed the ill-looking associate of the emigrant. "A real river must be crossed, not headed, like a bear in a country hunt." Footnote: There is a practice in the new countries to assemble the men of a large district, sometimes of an entire county, to exterminate the beasts of prey. They form themselves into a circle of several miles in extent, and gradually draw nearer, killing all before them. The allusion is to this custom, in which the hunted beast is turned from one to another. "Have you been far towards the sundown, friend?" interrupted the emigrant, as if he desired to keep his rough companion as much as possible out of the discourse. "I find it is a wide tract of clearing, this into which I have fallen." "You may travel weeks, and you will see it the same. I often think the Lord has placed this barren belt of prairie behind the States, to warn men to what their folly may yet bring the land. Ay, weeks, if not months, may you journey in these open fields, in which there is neither dwelling nor habitation for man or beast. Even the savage animals travel miles on miles to seek their dens, and yet the wind seldom blows from the east. But I conceit the sounds of axes, and the crash of falling trees, are in my ears." As the old man spoke with the seriousness and dignity that age seldom fails to communicate, even to the less striking sentiments, his auditors were deeply attentive, and as silent as the grave. Indeed, the trapper was left to renew the dialogue himself, which he soon did by asking a question, in the indirect manner so much in use by the border inhabitants. "You found it no easy matter to ford the water courses, and to make your way so deep into the prairies, friend, with the teams of horses and herds of horned beasts?" "I kept the left bank of the main river," the emigrant replied, "until I found the stream leading too much to the north, when we rafted ourselves across without any great suffering. The women lost a fleece or two from the next year's shearing, and the girls have one cow less to their dairy. Since then we have done bravely by bridging a creek every day or two." "It is likely you will continue west until you come to land more suitable for a settlement?" "Until I see reason to stop, or to turn again," the emigrant bluntly answered, rising at the same time, and cutting short the dialogue by the suddenness of the movement. His example was followed by the trapper, as well as the rest of the party, and then, without much deference to the presence of their guest, the travellers proceeded to make their dispositions to pass the night. Several little bowers, or rather huts, had already been formed of the tops of trees, blankets of coarse country manufacture, and the skins of buffaloes, united without much reference to any other object than temporary comfort. Into these covers the children, with their mother, soon drew themselves, and where it is more than possible, they were all speedily lost in the oblivion of sleep. Before the men, however, could seek their rest, they had sundry little duties to perform, such as completing the works of defence, carefully concealing the fires, replenishing the fodder of their cattle, and setting the watch that was to protect the party in the approaching hours of night. The former was effected by dragging the trunks of a few trees into the intervals left by the wagons, and along the open space between the vehicles and the thicket, on which, in military language, the encampment would be said to have rested, thus forming a sort of chevaux de frise on three sides of the position. Within these narrow limits, with the exception of what the tent contained, both man and beast were now collected, the latter being far too happy in resting their weary limbs, to give any undue annoyance to their scarcely more intelligent associates. Two of the young men took their rifles, and the first, renewing the priming, and examining the flints with the utmost care, they proceeded, the one to the extreme right, and the other to the left, of the encampment, where they posted themselves within the shadows of the thicket, but in such positions as enabled each to overlook the portion of the prairie. The trapper loitered about the place, declining to share the straw of the emigrant, until the whole arrangement was completed, and then, without the ceremony of an adieu, he slowly retired from the spot. It was now in the first watch of the night, and the pale, quivering, and deceptive light, from a new moon, was playing over the endless waves of the prairie, tipping the swells with gleams of brightness, and leaving the interval land in deep shadow. Accustomed to scenes of solitude like the present, the old man, as he left the encampment, proceeded alone into the waste, like a bold vessel leaving its haven to enter on the trackless field of the ocean. He appeared to move for some time without object, or indeed without any apparent consciousness, whither his limbs were carrying him. At length, on reaching the rise of one of the undulations, he came to a stand, and, for the first time since leaving the band, who had caused such a flood of reflections and recollections to crowd upon his mind, the old man became aware of his present situation. Throwing one end of his rifle to the earth, he stood leaning on the other, again lost in deep contemplation for several minutes, during which time his hound came and crouched at his feet. A deep, menacing growl from the faithful animal first aroused him from his musing. "What now, dog?" he said, looking down at his companion, as if he addressed a being of an intelligence equal to his own, and speaking in a voice of great affection. "What is it, pup? Huh? Hector, what is it nosing now? It won't do, dog, it won't do. The very fans play in open view of us, without minding so worn-out curs as you and I. Instinct is their gift, Hector, and they have found out how little we are to be feared. They have." The dog stretched his head upward, and responded to the words of his master by a long and plaintive whine, which he even continued after he had again buried his head in the grass, as if he held an intelligent communication with one who so well knew how to interpret dumb discourse. "This is a manifest warning, Hector," the trapper continued, dropping his voice to the tones of caution, and looking warily about him. "What is it, pup? Speak plainer, dog. What is it?" The hound had, however, already laid his nose to the earth, and was silent, appearing to slumber. But the keen, quick glances of his master soon caught a glimpse of a distant figure, which seemed through the deceptive light, floating along the very elevation on which he had placed himself. Presently its proportions became more distinct, and then an airy female form appeared to hesitate, as if considering whether it would be prudent to advance. Though the eyes of the dog were now to be seen glancing in the rays of the moon, opening and shutting lazily, he gave no further signs of displeasure. "Come nigher, we are friends," said the trapper, associating himself with his companion by long use, and, probably, through the strength of the secret tie that connected them together. "We are your friends. None will harm you." Encouraged by the mild tones of his voice, and perhaps led on by the earnestness of her purpose, the female approached, until she stood at his side, when the old man perceived his visitor to be the young woman with whom the reader has already become acquainted by the name of Ellen Wade. "I had thought you were gone," she said, looking timidly and anxiously around. "They said you were gone, and that we should never see you again. I did not think it was you." "Men are no common objects in these empty fields," returned the trapper, "and I humbly hope, though I have so long consorted with the beasts of the wilderness, that I have not yet lost the look of my kind." "Oh, I knew you to be a man, and I thought I knew the whine of the hound too," she answered hastily, as if willing to explain she knew not what, and then checking herself, like one fearful of having already said too much. "I saw no dogs among the teams of your father," the trapper remarked. "Father!" exclaimed the girl, feelingly. "I have no father. I had nearly said, no friend." The old man turned towards her, with a look of kindness and interest, that was even more conciliating than the ordinary, upright, and benevolent expression of his weather-beaten countenance. "Why then do you venture in a place where none but the strong should come?" he demanded. "Did you not know that when you crossed the big river, you left a friend behind that is always bound to look to the young and feeble like yourself?" "Of whom do you speak?" "The law. 'Tis bad to have it, but I sometimes think it is worse to be entirely without it. Age and weakness have brought me to feel such weakness, at times. Yes, the law is needed, when such as have not the gifts of strength and wisdom are to be taken care of. I hope, young woman, if you have no father, you have at least a brother." The maiden felt the tacit reproach conveyed in this covert question, and for a moment she remained in an embarrassed silence. But catching a glimpse of the mild and serious features of her companion, as he continued to gaze on her with a look of interest, she replied firmly, and in a manner that left no doubt she comprehended his meaning. "Heaven forbid that any such as you have seen should be a brother of mine, or anything else near or dear to me. But tell me, do you then actually live alone? Is this desert district, old man, is there really none here besides yourself?" "There are hundreds, nay thousands, of the rightful owners of the country, roving about the plains, but few of our own colour." "And have you then met none who are white but us?" interrupted the girl, like one too impatient to await the tardy explanations of age and deliberation. "Not in many days. Hush, Hector, hush," he added in reply to a low and nearly inaudible growl from his hound. "The dog scents mischief in the wind. The black bears from the mountains sometimes make their way even lower than this. The pup is not apt to complain of the harmless game. I am not so ready and true with the piece as I could be. Yet I have struck even the fiercest animals of the prairie in my time, so you have little reason for fear, young woman." The girl raised her eyes in that peculiar manner which is so often practised by her sex, when they commence their glances, by examining the earth at their feet, and terminate them by noting everything within the power of human vision, but she rather manifested the quality of impatience than any feeling of alarm. A short bark from the dog, however, soon gave a new direction to the looks of both, and then the real object of his second warning became dimly visible. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of The Prairie by James Fenimore Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Peck. "Come, come, thou art as hot a Jack in thy mood, as any in Italy, and as soon moved to be moody, and as soon moody to be moved." Romeo and Juliet. Though the trapper manifested some surprise when he perceived that another human figure was approaching him, and that, too, from a direction opposite to the place where the emigrant had made his encampment, it was with the steadiness of one long accustomed to scenes of danger. "This is the man," he said, "and one who has white blood in his veins, or his step would be lighter. It will be well to be ready for the worst, as to half and halves." Half-breeds, men born of Indian women by white fathers. This race has much of the depravity of civilization, without the virtues of the savage. "That one meets, in these distant districts, are altogether more barbarous than the real savage." He raised his rifle while he spoke, and assured himself of the state of its flint, as well as of the priming by manual examination. But his arm was arrested, while in the act of throwing forward the muzzle of the piece, by the eager and trembling hands of his companion. "For God's sake, be not too hasty," she said. "It may be a friend, an acquaintance, a neighbour." "A friend?" the old man repeated, deliberately releasing himself at the same time from her grasp. "Friends are rare in any land, and less in this perhaps than in another, and the neighbourhood is too thinly settled to make it likely that he who comes towards us is even an acquaintance." "But though a stranger, you would not seek his blood?" The trapper earnestly regarded her anxious and frightened features, and then he dropped the butt of his rifle on the ground, like one whose purpose had undergone a sudden change. "No," he said, speaking rather to himself than to his companion. "She is right. Blood is not to be spilt, to save the life of one so useless, and so near his time. Let him come on. My skins, my traps, and even my rifle shall be his, if he sees fit to demand them." "He will ask for neither. He wants neither," returned the girl. "If he be an honest man, he will surely be content with his own, and ask for nothing that is the property of another." The trapper had not time to express the surprise he felt at this incoherent and contradictory language, for the man who was advancing was already within 50 feet of the place where they stood. In the meantime, Hector had not been an indifferent witness of what was passing. At the sound of the distant footsteps, he had arisen from his warm bed at the feet of his master, and now, as the stranger appeared in open view, he stalked slowly towards him, crouching to the earth like a panther about to take his leap. "Call in your dog," said a firm, deep, manly voice in tones of friendship, rather than of menace. "I love a hound, and should be sorry to do an injury to the animal." "You hear what is said about you, pup," the trapper answered. "Come hither, fool. His growl and his bark are all that is left of him now. You may come on, friend. The hound is toothless." The stranger profited by the intelligence. He sprang eagerly forward, and at the next instant stood at the side of Ellen Wade. After assuring himself of the identity of the latter, by a hasty but keen glance, he turned his attention, with a quickness and impatience that proved the interest he took in the result, to a similar examination of her companion. "From what cloud have you fallen, my good old man?" he said in a careless, off-hand, heedless manner that seemed too natural to be assumed. "Or do you actually live, hereaway in the prairies?" "I have been long on earth, and never, I hope, nigher to heaven than I am at this moment," returned the trapper. "My dwelling, if dwelling I may be said to have, is not far distant. Now may I take the liberty with you that you are so willing to take with others? Whence do you come, and where is your home?" "Softly, softly. When I have done with my catechism, it will be time to begin with yours. What sport is this you follow by moonlight? You are not dodging the buffaloes at such an hour?" "I am, as you see, going from an encampment of travellers, which lies over yonder swell in the land, to my own wigwam. In doing so, I wrong no man." "All fair and true. And you got this young woman to show you the way, because she knows it so well and you know so little about it yourself?" "I met her, as I have met you, by accident. For 10 tiresome years have I dwelt on these open fields, and never, before to-night, have I found human beings with white skins on them at this hour. If my presence here gives offence, I am sorry, and will go my way. It is more than likely that when your young friend has told her story, you will be better given to believe mine." "Friend," said the youth, lifting a cap of skins from his head, and running his fingers leisurely through the dense mass of black and shaggy locks, "if I have ever laid eyes on the girl before to-night, may I—" "You've said enough, Paul," interrupted the female, laying her hand on his mouth, with a familiarity that gave something very like the lie direct to his intended asseveration. "Our secret will be safe with this honest old man. I know it by his looks and kind words." "Our secret! Ellen, have you forgot—" "Nothing. I have not forgotten anything I should remember. But still I say, we are safe with this honest trapper." "Trapper! Is he then a trapper? Give me your hand, father; our trades should bring us acquainted." "There is little call for handicrafts in this region," returned the other, examining the athletic and active form of the youth, as he leaned carelessly and not ungracefully on his rifle. "The art of taking the creatures of God in traps and nets is one that needs more cunning than manhood, and yet I am brought to practise it in my age. But it would be quite as seemly in one like you to follow a pursuit better becoming your years and courage." I never took even a slinking mink, or a paddling muskrat in a cage, though I admit having peppered a few of the dark-skinned devils, when I had much better have kept my powder in the horn, and the lead in its pouch. Not I, old man; nothing that crawls the earth is for my sport." "What then may you do for a living, friend? For little profit is to be made in these districts if a man denies himself his lawful right in the beasts of the fields." "I deny myself nothing. If a bear crosses my path, he is soon the mere ghost of Bruin. The deer begin to nose me, and as for the buffalo, I have killed more beef, old stranger, than the largest butcher in all Kentuck." "You can shoot, then?" demanded the trapper, with a glow of latent fire glimmering about his eyes. "Is your hand true, and your look quick?" "The first is like a steel trap, and the last nimbler than a buckshot. I wish it was hot noon now, grandfather, and that there was an acre or two of your white swans, or of black feathered ducks, going south, over our heads. You or Ellen, here, might set your heart on the finest flock, and my character against a horn of powder, that the bird would be hanging head downwards in 5 minutes, and that too with a single ball. I scorn a shotgun. No man can say he ever knew me to carry one, a rod." "The lad has good in him; I see it plainly by his manner," said the trapper, turning to Ellen with an encouraging air. "I will take it on myself to say, that you are not unwise in meeting him as you do. Tell me, lad, did you ever strike a leaping buck atwixt the antlers? Hector, quiet, pup, quiet! The very name of venison quickens the blood of the cur. Did you ever take an animal in that fashion, on the long leap?" You might just as well ask me, did you ever eat? There is no fashion, old stranger, that a deer has not been touched by my hand, unless it was when asleep." "Ay, you have a long and a happy and an honest life afore you. I am old, and I suppose I might also say, worn out and useless. But if it was given to me to choose my time and place again, as such things are not, and ought not, ever to be given to the will of man, though if such a gift was to be given me, I would say 20 and the wilderness. But tell me, how do you part with the peltry?" "With the pelts? I never took a skin from a buck, nor a quill from a goose in my life. I knock them over, now and then, for a meal, and sometimes to keep my finger true to the touch, but when hunger is satisfied, the prairie wolves get the remainder. No, I keep to my calling, which pays me better than all the fur I could sell on the other side of the big river." The old man appeared to ponder a little, but shaking his head, he soon continued. "I know of but one business that can be followed here with profit." He was interrupted by the youth, who raised a small cup of tin, which dangled at his neck before the other's eyes, and springing its lid, the delicious odour of the finest flavoured honey diffused itself over the organs of the trapper. "A bee hunter," observed the latter, with a readiness that proved he understood the nature of the occupation, though not without some little surprise at discovering one of the other's spirited mien engaged in so humble a pursuit. "It pays well in the skirts of the settlements, but I should call it a doubtful trade in the more open districts." "You think a tree is wanting for a swarm to settle in? But I know differently, and so I have stretched out a few hundred miles farther west than common, to taste your honey. And now I have baited your curiosity, stranger, you will just move aside, while I tell the remainder of my story to this young woman." "It is not necessary. I'm sure it is not necessary that he should leave us," said Ellen, with a haste that implied some little consciousness of the singularity, if not of the impropriety of the request. "You can have nothing to say that the whole world might not hear." "No? Well may I be stung to death by drones, if I understand the buzzings of a woman's mind. For my part, Ellen, I care for nothing nor anybody, and am just as ready to go down to the place where your uncle, if uncle you can call one, who I'll swear is no relation, has hoppled his teams, and tell the old man my mind now, as I shall be a year hence. You have only to say a single word, and the thing is done, let him like it or not." "You are ever so hasty and so rash, Paul Hover, that I seldom know when I am safe with you. How can you, who know the danger of our being seen together, speak of going before my uncle and his sons?" "Has he done that of which he has reason to be ashamed?" demanded the trapper, who had not moved an inch from the place he first occupied. "Heaven forbid! But there are reasons why he should not be seen just now, that could do him no harm, if known, but which may not yet be told. And so, if you will wait, father, near yonder willow bush, until I have heard what Paul can possibly have to say, I shall be sure to come and wish you a good night before I return to the camp." The trapper drew slowly aside, as if satisfied with the somewhat incoherent reason Ellen had given why he should retire. When completely out of earshot of the earnest and hurried dialogue that instantly commenced between the two he had left, the old man again paused, and patiently awaited the moment when he might renew his conversation with beings in whom he felt a growing interest, no less from the mysterious character of their intercourse than from a natural sympathy in the welfare of a pair so young, and who, as in the simplicity of his heart he was also fain to believe, were also so deserving. He was accompanied by his indolent but attached dog, who once more made his bed at the feet of his master, and soon lay slumbering as usual, with his head nearly buried in the dense fog of the prairie grass. It was a spectacle so unusual to see the human form amid the solitude in which he dwelt, that the trapper bent his eyes on the dim figures of his new acquaintances, with sensations to which he had long been a stranger. Their presence awakened recollections and emotions, to which his sturdy but honest nature had latterly paid but little homage, and his thoughts began to wander over the varied scenes of a life of hardships, that had been strangely blended with scenes of wild and peculiar enjoyment. The train taken by his thoughts had, already, conducted him, in imagination, far into an ideal world, when he was, once more suddenly, recalled to the reality of his situation by the movements of the faithful hound. The dog, who, in submission to his years and infirmities, had manifested such a decided propensity to sleep, now arose, and stalked from out the shadow cast by the tall person of his master, and looked abroad into the prairie, as if his instinct apprised him of the presence of still another visitor. Then, seemingly content with his examination, he returned to his comfortable post, and disposed of his weary limbs, with the deliberation and care of one who was no novice in the art of self-preservation. "What again, Hector?" said the trapper in a soothing voice, which he had the caution, however, to utter in an undertone. "What is it, dog? Tell it all to his master, pup. What is it?" Hector answered with another growl, but was content to continue in his lair. These were evidences of intelligence and distrust, to which one as practised as the trapper could not turn an inattentive ear. He again spoke to the dog, encouraging him to watchfulness by a low guarded whistle. The animal, however, as if conscious of having already discharged his duty, obstinately refused to raise his head from the grass. "A hint from such a friend is far better than man's advice," muttered the trapper, as he slowly moved towards the couple, who were yet too earnestly and abstractedly engaged in their own discourse to notice his approach. "And none but a conceited settler would hear it, and not respect it, as he ought. Children," he added, when nigh enough to address his companions, "we are not alone in these dreary fields. There are others stirring, and therefore, to the shame of our kind, be it said, danger is nigh." "If one of the lazy sons of skirting Ishmael is prowling out of his camp to-night," said the young bee-hunter, with a great vivacity, and in tones that might easily have been excited to a menace, "he may have an end put to his journey sooner than either he or his father is dreaming." "My life on it, they are all with the teams," hurriedly answered the girl. "I saw the whole of them asleep, myself, except the two on watch, and their natures have greatly changed, if they, too, are not both dreaming of a turkey hunt or a court-house fight at this very moment." "Some beast with a strong scent has passed between the wind and the hound, father, and it makes him uneasy, or perhaps he, too, is dreaming. I had a pup of my own in Kentuck, that would start upon a long chase from a deep sleep, and all upon the fancy of some dream. Go to him and pinch his ear, that the beast may feel the life within him." "Not so, not so," returned the trapper, shaking his head as one who better understood the qualities of his dog. "Youth sleeps, ay, and dreams too, but age is awake and watchful. The pup is never false with his nose, and long experience tells me to heed his warnings." "Did you ever run him upon the trail of carrion?" "Why, I must say that the ravenous beasts have sometimes tempted me to let him loose, for they are as greedy as men after the venison, in its season. But then I knew the reason of the dog would tell him the object. No, no, Hector is an animal known in the ways of man, and will never strike a false trail, when a true one is to be followed." "Ay, the secret is out. You have run the hound on the track of a wolf, and his nose has a better memory than his master," said the bee-hunter, laughing. "I have seen the creature sleep for hours, with pack after pack in open view. A wolf might eat out of his tray without a snarl, unless there was a scarcity. Then indeed Hector would be apt to claim his own." "There are panthers down from the mountains. I saw one make a leap at a sick deer as the sun was setting. Go you back to the dog, and tell him the truth, father. In a minute He was interrupted by a long, loud, and piteous howl from the hound, which rose on the air of the evening, like the wailing of some spirit of the place, and passed off into the prairie, in cadences that rose and fell, like its own undulating surface. The trapper was impressively silent, listening intently. Even the reckless bee-hunter was struck with the wailing wildness of the sounds. After a short pause, the former whistled the dog to his side, and turning to his companions, he said with the seriousness which in his opinion the occasion demanded— "They who think man enjoys all the knowledge of the creatures of God will live to be disappointed if they reach, as I have done, the age of 80 years. I will not take upon myself to say what mischief is brewing, nor will I vouch that even the hound himself knows so much. But that evil is nigh, and that wisdom invites us to avoid it. I have heard from the mouth of one who never lies. I did think the pup had become unused to the footsteps of man, and that your presence made him uneasy. but his nose has been on a long scent the whole evening, and what I mistook as a notice of your coming has been intended for something more serious. If the advice of an old man is, then, worth hearkening to, children, you will quickly go different ways to your places of shelter and safety." "If I quit Ellen at such a moment," exclaimed the youth, "may I—" "You said enough," the girl interrupted, by again interposing a band that might, both by its delicacy and colour, have graced a far more elevated station in life. "My time is out, and we must part, at all events, so good night, Paul. Father, good night." "Hist!" said the youth, seizing her arm, as she was in the very act of tripping from his side. "Hist! Do you hear nothing? There are buffaloes playing their pranks at no great distance. That sound beats the earth like a herd of the mad scampering devils." His two companions listened, as people in their situation would be apt to lend their faculties to discover the meaning of any doubtful noises, especially when heard after so many and such startling warnings. The unusual sounds were unequivocally, though still faintly, audible. The youth and his female companion had made several hurried and vacillating conjectures concerning their nature, when a current of the night air brought the rush of trampling footsteps too sensibly to their ears to render mistake any longer possible. "Am I right?" said the bee hunter. "A panther is driving a herd before him? Or, maybe, there is a battle among the beasts." "Your ears are cheats," returned the old man, who, from the moment his own organs had been able to catch the distant sounds, stood like a statue made to represent deep attention. "The leaps are too long for the buffaloe, and too regular for terror. Hish! Now they are in the bottom, where the grass is high, and the sound is deadened. Ay, there they go on the hard earth, and now they come up the swell, dead upon us. They will be here afore you can find a cover." "Come, Ellen," cried the youth, seizing his companion by the hand, "let us make a trail for the encampment." "Too late, too late!" exclaimed the trapper, "for the creatures are in the open view, and a bloody band of accursed Siouxes they are, by their thieving luck, and the random fashion in which they ride." "Siouxes or devils, they shall find us, men," said the bee hunter, with a mien as fierce as if he had led a party of superior strength, and of a courage equal to his own. "You have a piece, old man, and will pull a trigger in behalf of a helpless Christian girl?" "Down, down into the grass! Down with ye both!" whispered the trapper, intimating to them a turn aside to the tall weeds, which grew in a denser body than common near the place where they stood. "You've not the time to fly, nor the numbers to fight, foolish boy. Down into the grass, if you prize the young woman, or value the gift of life." His remonstrance, seconded as it was by a prompt and energetic action, did not fail to produce the submission to his order, which the occasion seemed, indeed, imperiously to require. The moon had fallen behind a sheet of thin, fleecy clouds, which skirted the horizon, leaving just enough of its faint and fluctuating light to render objects visible, dimly revealing their forms and proportions. The trapper, by exercising that species of influence over his companions, which experience and decision usually assert, in cases of emergency, had effectually succeeded in concealing them in the grass, and by the aid of the feeble rays of the luminary, he was enabled to scan the disorderly party which was riding like so many madmen directly upon them. A band of beings, who resembled demons rather than men, sporting in their nightly revels across the bleak plain, was in truth approaching, at a fearful rate, and in a direction to leave little hope that some one among them, at least, would not pass over the spot where the trapper and his companions lay. At intervals the clattering of hoofs was borne along by the night wind quite audibly in their front, and then again their progress through the fog of the autumnal grass was swift and silent, adding to the unearthly appearance of the spectacle. The trapper, who had called in his hound, and bidden him crouch at his side, now kneeled in the cover also, and kept a keen and watchful eye on the route of the band, soothing the fears of the girl, and restraining the impatience of the youth in the same breath. "If there is one, there's 30 of the miscreants," he said, in a sort of episode to his whispered comments. "Ay, ay, they are edging towards the river. Peace, pup, peace! No, here they come this way again. The thieves don't seem to know their own errand. If there were just 6 of us, lad, what a beautiful ambushment we might make upon them, from this very spot! It won't do, boy. Keep yourself closer, or your head will be seen. Besides, I'm not altogether strong in the opinion it would be lawful, as they have done us no harm. There they bend again to the river. No, here they come up the swell. Now is the moment to be as still, as if the breath had done its duty, and departed the body." The old man sunk into the grass while he was speaking, as if the final separation to which he alluded had, in his own case, actually occurred, and, at the next instant, a band of wild horsemen whirled by them, with the noiseless rapidity in which it might be imagined a troop of spectres would pass. The dark and fleeting forms were already vanished, when the trapper ventured again to raise his head to a level with the top of the bending herbage, motioning at the same time to his companions to maintain their positions and their silence. "They are going down the swell towards the encampment," he continued in his former guarded tones. "No, they halt in the bottom, and are clustering together like deer in a council. By the Lord, they are turning again, and we are not yet done with the reptiles." Once more he sought his friendly cover, and at the next instant the dark troop were to be seen riding, in a disorderly manner, on the very summit of the little elevation on which the trapper and his companions lay. It was now soon apparent that they had returned to avail themselves of the height of the ground, in order to examine the dim horizon. Some dismounted, while others rode to and fro, like men engaged in a local inquiry of much interest. Happily for the hidden party, the grass in which they were concealed not only served to screen them from the eyes of the savages, but opposed an obstacle to prevent their horses, which were no less rude and untrained than their riders, from trampling on them in their irregular and wild paces. At length an athletic and dark-looking Indian, who by his air of authority would seem to be the leader, summoned his chiefs about him to a consultation, which was held mounted. This body was collected on the very margin of that mass of herbage in which the trapper and his companions were hid. As the young man looked up and saw the fierce aspect of the group, which was increasing at each instant by the accession of some countenance and figure, apparently more forbidding than any which had preceded it, he drew his rifle, by a very natural impulse, from beneath him, and commenced putting it in a state for service. The female at his side buried her face in the grass, by a feeling that was, possibly, quite as natural to her sex and habits, leaving him to follow the impulses of his hot blood, but his aged and more prudent adviser whispered sternly in his ear— "The tick of the lock is as well known to the knaves as the blast of a trumpet to a soldier. Lay down the piece! Lay down the piece! Should the moon touch the barrel, it could not fail to be seen by the devils, whose eyes are keener than the blackest snakes. The smallest motion now would be sure to bring an arrow among us." The bee hunter so far obeyed as to continue immovable and silent. But there was still sufficient light to convince his companion, by the contracted brow and threatening eye of the young man, that a discovery would not bestow a bloodless victory on the savages. Finding his advice disregarded, the trapper took his measures accordingly, and awaited the result with a resignation and calmness that were characteristic of the individual. In the meantime, the Siouxes, for the sagacity of the old man was not deceived in the character of his dangerous neighbours, had terminated their council, and were again dispersed along the ridge of land as if they sought some hidden object. "The imps have heard the hound," whispered the trapper, "and their ears are too true to be cheated in the distance. Keep close, lad, keep close. Down with your head to the very earth, like a dog that sleeps." "Let us rather take to our feet and trust to manhood," returned his impatient companion. He would have proceeded, but feeling a hand laid rudely on his shoulder, he turned his eyes upward, and beheld the dark and savage countenance of an Indian gleaming full upon him. Notwithstanding the surprise and the disadvantage of his attitude, the youth was not disposed to become a captive so easily. Quicker than the flash of his own gun, he sprang upon his feet, and was throttling his opponent with a power that would soon have terminated the contest, when he felt the arms of the trapper thrown around his body, confining his exertions by a strength very little inferior to his own. Before he had time to reproach his comrade for this apparent treachery, a dozen Siouxes were around them, and the whole party were compelled to yield themselves as prisoners. End of chapter 3. the Prairie by James Fenimore Cooper. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by William Peck. With much more dismay I view the fight, than those that make the fray. Merchant of Venice. The unfortunate bee hunter and his companions had become the captives of a people who might, without exaggeration, be called the Ishmaelites of the American deserts. From time immemorial, the hands of the Sioux have been turned against their neighbours of the prairies, and even at this day, when the influence and authority of a civilized government are beginning to be felt around them, they are considered a treacherous and dangerous race. At the period of our tale, the case was far worse. Few white men, trusting themselves in the remote and unprotected regions, where so false a tribe was known to dwell. Notwithstanding the peaceable submission of the trapper, he was quite aware of the character of the band into whose hands he had fallen. It would have been difficult, however, for the nicest judge to have determined whether fear, policy, or resignation formed the secret motive of the old man, in permitting himself to be plundered as he did, without a murmur. So far from opposing any remonstrance to the rude and violent manner in which his conquerors performed the customary office, he even anticipated their cupidity, by tendering to the chiefs such articles as he thought might prove the most acceptable. On the other hand, Paul Hover, who had been literally a conquered man, manifested the strongest repugnance to submit to the violent liberties that were taken with his person and property. He even gave several exceedingly unequivocal demonstrations of his displeasure during the summary process, and would, more than once, have broken out in open and desperate resistance, but for the admonitions and entreaties of the trembling girl, who clung to his side in a manner so dependent as to show the youth that her hopes were now placed no less on his discretion than on his disposition to serve her. The Indians had, however, no sooner deprived the captives of their arms and ammunition, and stripped them of a few articles of dress of little use, and perhaps of less value, than they appeared disposed to grant them a respite. Business of greater moment pressed on their hands, and required their attention. Another consultation of the chiefs was convened, and it was apparent, by the earnest and vehement manner of the few who spoke, that the warriors conceived their success as yet to be far from complete. "It will be well," whispered the trapper, who knew enough of the language he heard to comprehend perfectly the subject of the discussion, "if the travellers who lie near the willow brake are not awoke out of their sleep by a visit from these miscreants. They are too cunning to believe that a woman of the pale faces is to be found so far from the settlements, without having a white man's inventions and comforts at hand." "If they will carry the tribe of wandering Ishmael to the Rocky Mountains," said the young bee hunter, laughing at his vexation with a sort of bitter merriment, "I may forgive the rascals." "Paul! Paul!" exclaimed his companion in a tone of reproach, "you forget all. Think of the dreadful consequences." "It was thinking of what you call consequences, Ellen, that prevented me from putting the matter at once to yonder red devil, and making it a real knock down and drag out. Old trapper, the sin of this cowardly business lies on your shoulders. But it is no more than your daily calling, I reckon, to take men as well as beasts in snares." "I implore you, Paul, to be calm, to be patient." "Well, since it is your wish, Ellen," returned the youth, endeavouring to swallow his spleen, "I will make the trial, though, as you ought to know, it is part of the religion of a Kentuckian to fret himself a little at a mischance." "I fear your friends in the other bottom will not escape the eyes of the imps," continued the trapper, as coolly as though he had not heard a syllable of the intervening discourse. "They scent plunder, and it would be as hard to drive a hound from his game, as to throw the varmints from its trail." "Is there nothing to be done?" asked Ellen, in an imploring manner, which proved the sincerity of her concern. "It would be an easy matter to call out in so loud a voice as to make old Ishmael dream that the wolves were among his flock," Paul replied. "I can make myself heard a mile in these open fields, and his camp is but a short quarter from us." "And get knocked on the head for your pains?" returned the trapper. "No, no, cunning must match cunning, or the hounds will murder the whole family." "Murder? No, murder? Ishmael loves travel so well that there would be no harm in his having a look at the other sea, but the old fellow is in bad condition to take the long journey. I would try a lock myself, before he should be quite murdered." "His party is strong in number, and well armed. Do you think it will fight?" "Look here, old trapper, few men love Ishmael Bush and his 7 sledge-hammer sons less than one Paul Hover, but I scorn to slander even a Tennessee shotgun. There is as much of the true stand-up courage among them, as there is in any family that was ever raised in Kentuck itself. They are a long-sided and a double-jointed breed, and let me tell you, that he who takes the measure of one of them on the ground must be a workman at a hug." "Hist! The savages have done their talk, and are about to set their accursed devices in motion. Let us be patient. Something may yet offer in favour of your friends." "Friends! Call none of the race a friend of mine, trapper, if you have the smallest regard for my affection. What I say in their favour is less from love than honesty." "I did not know but the young woman was of the kin," returned the other, a little dryly, "but no offence should be taken, where none was intended." The mouth of Paul was again stopped by the hand of Ellen, who took on herself to reply, in her conciliating tones— "We should be all of a family, when it is in our power to serve each other. We depend entirely on your experience, honest old man, to discover the means to apprise our friends of their danger." "There will be a real time of it," muttered the bee hunter, laughing, "if the boys get at work in good earnest with these redskins." He was interrupted by a general movement which took place among the band. The Indians dismounted to a man, giving their horses in charge to 3 or 4 of the party, who were also entrusted with the safe keeping of the prisoners. They then formed themselves in a circle around a warrior who appeared to possess the chief authority, and at a given signal the whole array moved slowly and cautiously from the centre in straight and consequently in diverging lines. Most of their dark forms were soon blended with the brown covering of the prairie, though the captives, who watched the slightest movement of their enemies with vigilant eyes, were now and then enabled to discern a human figure drawn against the horizon as some one, more eager than the rest, rose to his greatest height in order to extend the limits of his view. But it was not long before even these fugitive glimpses of the moving and constantly increasing circle were lost, and uncertainty and conjecture were added to apprehension. In this manner passed many anxious and weary minutes, during the close of which the listeners expected at each moment to hear the whoop of the assailants and the shrieks of the assailed, rising together on the stillness of the night. But it would seem that the search which was so evidently making was without a sufficient object, for at the expiration of a half hour, the different individuals of the breed began to return singly, gloomy and sullen, like men who were disappointed. "Our time is at hand," observed the trapper, who noted the smallest incident, or the slightest indication of hostility among the savages. "We are now to be questioned, and if I know anything of the policy of our case, I should say it would be wise to choose one among us to hold the discourse, in order that our testimony may agree. And furthermore, if an opinion from one as old and as worthless as a hunter of 80 is to be regarded, I would just venture to say, that man should be the one most skilled in the nature of an Indian, and that he should also know something of their language. Are you acquainted with the tongue of the Sioux, friend?" "Swarm your own hive," returned the discontented bee hunter. "You are good at buzzing, old trapper, if you are good at nothing else." "'Tis the gift of youth to be rash and heady," the trapper calmly retorted. "The day has been, boy, when my blood was like your own, too swift and too hot to run quietly in my veins. But what will it profit to talk of silly risks and foolish acts at this time of life? A grey head should cover a brain of reason, and not the tongue of a boaster."
"True, true," whispered Ellen, "and we have other things to attend to now. Here comes the Indian to put his questions."
The girl, whose apprehensions had quickened her senses, was not deceived. She was yet speaking when a tall, half-naked savage approached the spot where they stood, and after examining the whole party as closely as the dim light permitted, for more than a minute in perfect stillness, he gave the usual salutation in the harsh and guttural tones of his own language. The trapper replied as well as he could, which it seemed was sufficiently well to be understood. In order to escape the imputation of pedantry, we shall render the substance, and, so far as it is possible, the form of the dialogue that succeeded, into the English tongue. "Have the pale-faces eaten their own buffaloes, and taken the skins from their own beavers?" continued the savage, allowing the usual moment of decorum to elapse, after the words of greeting, before he again spoke. "That they come to count how many are left among the Pawnees?" "Some of us are here to buy, and some to sell," returned the trapper, "but none will follow, if they hear it is not safe to come nigh the lodge of a Sioux." "The Siouxs are thieves, and they live among the snow. Why do we talk of a people who are so far, when we are in the country of the Pawnees?" "If the Pawnees are the owners of this land, then white and red are here by equal right." "Have not the pale-faces stolen enough from the red men, that you come so far to carry a lie? I have said this is a hunting ground of my tribe." "My right to be here is equal to your own," the trapper rejoined, with undisturbed coolness. "I do not speak as I might. It is better to be silent. The Pawnees and the white men are brothers, but a Sioux dare not show his face in the village of the Loups." "The Dahcotahs are men!" exclaimed the savage fiercely, forgetting in his anger to maintain the character he had assumed, and using the appellation of which his nation was most proud. "The Dahcotahs have no fear. Speak! What brings you so far from the villages of the pale-faces?" "I have seen the sun rise, and sat on many councils, and have heard the words of wise men. Let your chiefs come, and my mouth shall not be shut." "I am a great chief," said the savage, affecting an air of offended dignity. "Do you take me for an Assiniboine? Weucha is a warrior often named, and much believed." "Am I a fool not to know a burnt wood Teton?" demanded the trapper, with a steadiness that did great credit to his nerves. "Go! It is dark, and you do not see that my head is grey." The Indian now appeared convinced that he had adopted too shallow an artifice to deceive one so practised as the man he addressed, and he was deliberating what fiction he should next invent, in order to obtain his real object, when a slight commotion among the band put an end at once to all his schemes. Casting his eyes behind him, as if fearful of a speedy interruption, he said, in tones much less pretending than those he had first resorted to— "Give Weucha the milk of Long Knives, and he will sing your name in the ears of the great men of his tribe." "Go," repeated the trapper, motioning him away with strong disgust. "Your young men are speaking of Mahtoree. My words are for the ears of a chief." The savage cast a look at the other, which, notwithstanding the dim light, was sufficiently indicative of implacable hostility. He then stole away among his fellows, anxious to conceal the counterfeit he had attempted to practise, no less than the treachery he had contemplated against a fair division of the spoils, from the man named by the trapper, whom he now also knew to be approaching, by the manner in which his name passed from one to another in the band. He had hardly disappeared before a warrior of powerful frame advanced out of the dark circle, and placed himself before the captives, with that high and proud bearing for which a distinguished Indian chief is ever so remarkable. He was followed by all the party, who arranged themselves around his person in a deep and respectful silence. "The earth is very large," the chief commenced, after a pause of that true dignity, which his counterfeit had so miserably affected. "Why can the children of my great white father never find room on it?" "Some among them have heard that their friends in the prairies are in want of many things," returned the trapper, "and they have come to see if it be true. Some want, in their turns, what the red men are willing to sell, and they come to make their friends rich with powder and blankets." "Do traders cross the big river with empty hands?" "Our hands are empty because your young men thought we were tired, and they have lightened us of our load. They were mistaken. I am old, but I am still strong." "It cannot be. Your load has fallen in the prairies. Show my young men the place, that they may pick it up before the Pawnees find it." "The path to the spot is crooked, and it is night. The hour is come for sleep," said the trapper, with a perfect composure. "Bid your warriors go over yonder hill. There is water, and there is wood.
Let them light their fires and sleep with warm feet. When the sun comes again I will speak to you."
A low murmur, but one that was clearly indicative of dissatisfaction, passed among the attentive listeners, and served to inform the old man that he had not been sufficiently wary in proposing a measure that he intended should notify the travellers in the break of the presence of their dangerous neighbours. Mahtoree, however, was without betraying in the slightest degree the excitement which was so strongly exhibited by his companions, continued the discourse in the same lofty manner as before. "I know that my friend is rich," he said, "that he has many warriors not far off, and that horses are plentier with him than dogs among the redskins."
"You see my warriors and my horses."
"What! Has the woman the feet of a Dahcotah, that she can walk for 30 nights in the prairies, and not fall? I know the red men of the woods make long marches on foot, but we, who live where the eye cannot see from one ledge to another, love our horses." The trapper now hesitated in his turn. He was perfectly aware that deception, if detected, might prove dangerous, and, for one of his pursuits and character, he was strongly troubled with an unaccommodating regard for the truth. But, recollecting that he controlled the fate of others as well as of himself, he determined to let things take their course, and to permit the Dahcotah chief to deceive himself if he would.
"The women of the Sioux and of the white men are not of the same wigwam," he answered evasively. "Would a Teton warrior make his wife greater than himself? I know he would not, and yet my ears have heard that there are lands where the councils are held by squaws."
Another slight movement in the dark circle apprized the trapper that his declaration was not received without surprise, if entirely without distrust. The chief alone seemed unmoved, nor was he disposed to relax from the loftiness and high dignity of his air. "My white fathers who live on the Great Lakes have declared," he said, "that their brothers towards the rising sun are not men, and now I know they did not lie. Go. What is a nation whose chief is a squaw? Are you the dog and not the husband of this woman?"
"I am neither. Never did I see her face before this day. She came into the prairies because they had told her a great and generous nation called the Dahcotahs lived there, and she wished to look on men. The women of the pale faces, like the women of the Sioux, open their eyes to see things that are new. But she is poor, like myself, and she will want corn and buffaloes, if you take away the little that she and her friends still have."
"My ears listen to many wicked lies!" exclaimed the Teton warrior, in a voice so stern that it startled even his red auditors. "Am I a woman? Has not a Dahcotah eyes? Tell me, white hunter, who are the men of your colour that sleep near the fallen trees?" As he spoke, the indignant chief pointed in the direction of Ishmael's encampment, leaving the trapper no reason to doubt that the superior industry and sagacity of this man had effected a discovery, which had eluded the search of the rest of his party. Notwithstanding his regret at an event that might prove fatal to the sleepers, and some little vexation at having been so completely outwitted in the dialogue just related, the old man continued to maintain his air of inflexible composure.
"It may be true," he answered, "that white men are sleeping in the prairie. If my brother says it, it is true. But what men does trust to the generosity of the Tetons, I cannot tell. If they be strangers asleep, send your young men to wake them up, and let them say why they are here. Every pale-face has a tongue."
The chief shook his head with a wild and fierce smile, answering abruptly as he turned away to put an end to the conference. "The Dahcotahs are a wise, and Mahtoree is their chief. He will not call to the strangers, that they may rise and speak to him with their carabines. He will whisper softly in their ears. When this is done, let the men of their own colour come and awake them." As he uttered these words, and turned on his heel, a low and approving laugh passed among the dark circle, which instantly broke its order and followed him to a little distance from the stand of the captives, where those who might presume to mingle opinions with so great a warrior again gathered about him in consultation. Weucha profited by the occasion to renew his importunities, but the trapper, who had discovered how great a counterfeit he was, shook him off in displeasure. An end was, however, more effectually put to the annoyance of this malignant savage, by a mandate for the whole party, including men and beasts, to change their positions. The movement was made in dead silence, and with an order that would have done credit to more enlightened beings. A halt, however, was soon made, and when the captives had time to look about them, they found they were in view of the low, dark outline of the corpse, near which lay the slumbering party of Ishmael. Here another short but grave and deliberate consultation was held. The beasts, which seemed trained to such covert and silent attacks, were once more placed under the care of keepers, who, as before, were charged with the duty of watching the prisoners. The mind of the trapper was in no degree relieved from the uneasiness, which was at each instant getting a stronger possession of him, when he found Weucha was placed nearest to his own person, and, as it appeared by the air of the triumph and authority he assumed, at the head of the guard also. The savage, however, who doubtless had his secret instructions, was content for the present with making a significant gesture with his tomahawk, which menaced death to Ellen. After admonishing in this expressive manner his male captives of the fate that would instantly attend their female companion, on the slightest alarm proceeding from any of the party, he was content to maintain a rigid silence. This unexpected forbearance, on the part of Weucha, enabled the trapper and his two associates to give their undivided attention to the little that might be seen of the interesting movements which were passing in their front. Mahtoree took the entire disposition of the arrangements on himself. He pointed out the precise situation he wished each individual to occupy, like one intimately acquainted with the qualifications of his respective followers, and he was obeyed with the deference and promptitude with which an Indian warrior is wont to submit to the instructions of his chief, in moments of trial. Some he dispatched to the right, and others to the left. Each man departed with the noiseless and quick step peculiar to the race, until all had assumed their allotted stations, with the exception of the two chosen warriors who remained nigh the person of their leader. When the rest had disappeared, Mahtoree turned to these select companions, and intimated by a sign that the critical moment had arrived, when the enterprise he contemplated was to be put in execution. Each man laid aside the light fowling piece, which, under the name of a carabine, he carried in virtue of his rank, and divesting himself of every article of exterior or heavy clothing, he stood resembling a dark and fierce-looking statue, in the attitude and nearly in the garb of nature. Mahtoree assured himself of the right position of his tomahawk, felt that his knife was secure in its sheath of skin, tightened his girdle of wampum, and saw that the lacing of his fringed and ornamental leggings was secure, and likely to offer no impediment to his exertions. Thus prepared at all points, and ready for his desperate undertaking, the Teton gave the signal to proceed. The three advanced in a line with the encampment of the travellers until, in the dim light by which they were seen, their dusky forms were nearly lost to the eyes of the prisoners. Here they paused, looking around them like men who deliberate and ponder long on the consequences before they take a desperate leap. Then, sinking together, they became lost in the grass of the prairie. It is not difficult to imagine the distress and anxiety of the different spectators of these threatening movements. Whatever might be the reasons of Ellen for entertaining no strong attachment to the family in which she has first been seen by the reader, the feelings of her sex, and, perhaps, some lingering seeds of kindness, predominated. More than once she felt tempted to brave the awful and instant danger that awaited such an offence, and to raise her feeble, and, in truth, impotent voice in warning. So strong, indeed, and so very natural was the inclination, that she would most probably have put it in execution, but for the often repeated, though whispered remonstrances of Paul Hover. In the breast of the young bee-hunter himself there was a singular union of emotions. His first and chiefest solicitude was certainly in behalf of his gentle and dependent companion, but the sense of her danger was mingled, in the breast of the reckless woodsman, with a consciousness of a high and wild, and by no means an unpleasant, excitement. Though united to the emigrants by ties still less binding than those of Ellen, he longed to hear the crack of their rifles, and had occasion offered, he would gladly have been amongst the first to rush to their rescue. There were in truth moments when he felt in his turn an impulse, that was nearly resistless, to spring forward and awake the unconscious sleepers. but a glance at Ellen would serve to recall his tottering prudence, and to admonish him of the consequences. The trapper alone remained calm and observant, as if nothing that involved his personal comfort or safety had occurred. His ever-moving, vigilant eyes watched the smallest change, with the composure of one too long inured to scenes of danger to be easily moved, and with an expression of cool determination, which denoted the intention he actually harboured, of profiting by the smallest oversight on the part of the captors. In the meantime, the Teton warriors had not been idle. Profiting by the high fog which grew in the bottoms, they had wormed their way through the matted grass, like so many treacherous serpents stealing on their prey, until the point was gained, where an extraordinary caution became necessary to their further advance. Mahtoree alone had occasionally elevated his dark, grim countenance above the herbage, straining his eyeballs to penetrate the gloom which skirted the border of the brake. In these momentary glances he gained sufficient knowledge, added to that he had obtained in his former search, to be the perfect master of the position of his intended victims, though he was still profoundly ignorant of their numbers and of their means of defence. His efforts to possess himself of the requisite knowledge concerning these two latter and essential points were, however, completely baffled by the stillness of the camp, which lay in a quiet as deep as if it were literally a place of the dead. Too wary and distrustful to rely, in circumstances of so much doubt, on the discretion of any less firm and crafty than himself, the Dahcotah bade his companions remain where they lay, and pursued the adventure alone. The progress of Mahtoree was now slow, and to one less accustomed to such a species of exercise, it would have proved painfully laborious. But the advance of the wily snake itself is not more certain or noiseless than was his approach. He drew his form, foot by foot, through the bending grass, pausing at each movement to catch the smallest sound that might betray any knowledge, on the part of the travellers, of his proximity. He succeeded, at length, in dragging himself out of the sickly light of the moon, into the shadows of the brake, where not only his dark person was much less liable to be seen, but where the surrounding objects became more distinctly visible to his keen and active glances. Here the Teton paused long and warily to make his observations before he ventured further. His position enabled him to bring the whole encampment, with its tent, wagons, and lodges, into a dark but clearly marked profile, furnishing a clue by which the practised warrior was led to a tolerably accurate estimate of the force he was about to encounter. Still an unnatural silence pervaded the spot, as if men suppressed even the quiet breathings of sleep, in order to render the appearance of their confidence more evident. The chief bent his head to the earth, and listened intently. He was about to raise it again, in disappointment, when the long-drawn and trembling respiration of one who slumbered imperfectly met his ear. The Indian was too well skilled in all the means of deception to become himself the victim of any common artifice. He knew the sound to be natural by its peculiar quivering, and he hesitated no longer. A man of nerves less tried than those of the fierce and conquering Mahtoree would have been keenly sensible of all the hazard he incurred. The reputation of those hardy and powerful white adventurers, who so often penetrated the wilds inhabited by his people, was well known to him. But while he drew nigher, with the respect and caution that a brave enemy never fails to inspire, it was with the vindictive animosity of a red man, jealous and resentful of the inroads of the stranger. Turning from the line of his former route, the Teton dragged himself directly towards the margin of the thicket. When this material object was effected in safety, he arose to his seat, and took a better survey of his situation. A single moment served to apprise him of the place where the unsuspecting traveller lay. The reader will readily anticipate that the savage had succeeded in gaining a dangerous proximity to one of those slothful sons of Ishmael, who were deputed to watch over the isolated encampment of the travellers. When certain that he was undiscovered, the Dahcotah raised his person again, and bending forward, he moved his dark visage above the face of the sleeper, in that sort of wanton and subtle manner with which the reptile is seen to play about its victim before it strikes. Satisfied at length, not only of the condition but of the character of the stranger, Mahtoree was in the act of withdrawing his head, when a slight movement of the sleeper announced the symptoms of reviving consciousness. The savage seized the knife which hung at his girdle, and in an instant it was poised above the breast of the young emigrant. Then, changing his purpose, with an action as rapid as his own flashing thoughts, he sunk back behind the trunk of the fallen tree against which the other reclined, and lay in its shadow, as dark, as motionless, and apparently as insensible as the wood itself. The slothful sentinel opened his heavy eyes, and gazing upwards for a moment at the hazy heavens, he made an extraordinary exertion, and raised his powerful frame from the support of the log. Then he looked about him, with an air of something like watchfulness, suffering his dull glances to run over the misty objects of the encampment, until they finally settled on the distant and dim field of the open prairie. Meeting with nothing more attractive than the same faint outlines of swell and interval, which everywhere rose before his drowsy eyes, he changed his position so as completely to turn his back on his dangerous neighbour, and suffered his person to sink sluggishly down into its former recumbent attitude. A long, and, on the part of the Teton, an anxious and painful silence succeeded, before the deep breathing of the traveller again announced that he was indulging in his slumbers. The savage was, however, far too jealous of a counterfeit to trust to the first appearance of sleep. But the fatigues of a day of unusual toil lay too heavily on the sentinel to leave the other long in doubt. Still, the motion with which Mahtoree again raised himself to his knees was so noiseless and guarded, that even a vigilant observer might have hesitated to believe he stirred. The change was, however, at length effected, and the Dahcotah chief then bent again over his enemy, without having produced a noise louder than that of the cottonwood leaf which fluttered at his side in the currents of the passing air. Mahtoree now felt himself master of the sleeper's fate, at the same time that he scanned the vast proportions and athletic limbs of the youth, in that sort of admiration which physical excellence seldom fails to excite in the breast of a savage. He coolly prepared to extinguish the principle of vitality which could alone render them formidable. After making himself sure of the seat of life, by gently removing the folds of the intervening cloth, he raised his keen weapon, and was about to unite his strength and skill in the impending blow, when the young man threw his brawny arm carelessly backward, exhibiting in the action the vast volume of its muscles. The sagacious and wary Teton paused. It struck his acute faculties that sleep was less dangerous to him at that moment than even death itself might prove. The smallest noise, the agony of struggling, with which such a frame would probably relinquish its hold of life, suggested themselves to his rapid thoughts, and were all present to his experienced senses. He looked back into the encampment, turned his head into the thicket, and glanced his glowing eyes abroad into the wild and silent prairies. Bending once more over the respited victim, he assured himself that he was sleeping heavily, and then abandoned his immediate purpose in obedience alone to the suggestions of a more crafty policy. The retreat of Mahtoree was as still and guarded as had been his approach. He now took the direction of the encampment, stealing along the margin of the brake, as a cover into which he might easily plunge at the smallest alarm. The drapery of the solitary hut attracted his notice in passing. After examining the whole of its exterior, and listening with painful intensity, in order to gather counsel from his ears, the savage ventured to raise the cloth at the bottom, and to thrust his dark visage beneath. It might have been a minute before the Teton chief drew back, and seated himself with the whole of his form without the linen tenement. Here he sat, seemingly brooding over his discovery for many moments, in rigid inaction. Then he resumed his crouching attitude, and once more projected his visage beyond the covering of the tent. His second visit to the interior was longer, and, if possible, more ominous than the first. But it had, like everything else, its termination, and the savage again withdrew his glaring eyes from the secrets of the place. Mahtoree had drawn his person many yards from the spot, in his slow progress towards the cluster of objects which pointed out the centre of the position, before he again stopped. He made another pause, and looked back at the solitary little dwelling he had left, as if doubtful whether he should not return. But the chevaux de frise of branches now lay within reach of his arm, and the very appearance of precaution it presented, as it announced the value of the effects it encircled, tempted his cupidity, and induced him to proceed. The passage of the savage, through the tender and brittle limbs of the cottonwood, could be likened only to the sinuous and noiseless winding of the reptiles which he imitated. When he had effected his object, and had taken an instant to become acquainted with the nature of the localities within the enclosure, the Teton used the precaution to open a way through which he might make a swift retreat. Then, raising himself on his feet, he stalked through the encampment like a master of evil, seeking whom and what he should first devote to his fell purposes. He had already ascertained the contents of the lodge in which were collected the woman and her young children, and had passed several gigantic frames, stretched on different piles of brush, which happily for him lay in unconscious helplessness, when he reached the spot occupied by Ishmael in person. It could not escape the sagacity of one like Mahtoree, that he had now within his power the principal man among the travellers. He stood long hovering above the recumbent and herculean form of the emigrant, keenly debating in his own mind the chances of his enterprise, and the most effectual means of reaping its richest harvest. He sheathed the knife, which, under the hasty and burning impulse of his thoughts, he had been tempted to draw, and was passing on, when Ishmael turned in his lair, and demanded roughly who was moving before his half-open eyes. Nothing short of the readiness and cunning of a savage could have evaded the crisis. Imitating the gruff tones and nearly unintelligible sounds he heard, Mahtoree threw his body heavily on the earth, and appeared to dispose himself to sleep. Though the whole movement was seen by Ishmael, in a sort of stupid observation, the artifice was too bold and too admirably executed to fail. The drowsy father closed his eyes, and slept heavily, with this treacherous inmate in the very bosom of his family. It was necessary for the Teton to maintain the position he had taken, for many long and weary minutes, in order to make sure that he was no longer watched. Though his body lay so motionless, his active mind was not idle. He profited by the delay to mature a plan, which he intended should put the whole encampment, including both its effects and their proprietors, entirely at his mercy. The instant he could do so, with safety, the indefatigable savage was again in motion. He took his way towards the slight pen which contained the domestic animals, worming himself along the ground in his former subtle and guarded manner. The first animal he encountered among the beasts occasioned a long and hazardous delay. The weary creature, perhaps conscious, through its secret instinct, that in the endless wastes of the prairies its surest protector was to be found in man, was so exceedingly docile as quietly to submit to the close examination it was doomed to undergo. The hand of the wandering Teton passed over the downy coat, the meek countenance, and the slender limbs of the gentle creature, with untiring curiosity. But he finally abandoned the prize, as useless in his predatory expeditions, and offering too little temptation to the appetite. As soon as, however, as he found himself among the beasts of burden, his gratification was extreme, and it was with difficulty that he restrained the customary ejaculations of pleasure, that were more than once on the point of bursting from his lips. Here he lost sight of the hazards by which he had gained access to his dangerous position, and the watchfulness of the wary and long-practised warrior was momentarily forgotten in the exultation of the savage. End of chapter 4.